Welcome back to our discussion of custom designs. This is one of my favorite and most exciting part of the whole quilt making process, is to do those custom designs for a very special quilt. And I want to show you one here that I redesigned rather, or designed, whichever we want to call it, from a traditional pattern. I took the giant dahlia, which is an old pattern, and you see this in this magazine here. Has a lot of rays, probably 16 different petals, 4 or 5 or 6 segments within each one. That was a little bit more difficult than I wanted to deal with. So I took the idea, and using the protractors and lines, etc., I drew that down into a 12-point design rather than the 16 or 18 that you would find in the tradition. 12 points, then, when I finally decided on the drawing, would give me an opportunity to use the 3 primary and 3 secondary colors in the rainbow. So the design came out called the Rainbow Dahlia, because those are the colors that I used. Then I reduced the number of sections within each of those rays down to 4, because I found that I was able to find 4 values of a color much easier than I could the 16 or 8. Because on the original quilt, which you see here on the left, and which will show in its full size a little bit later on, it took me months and months and months at shopping quilt shows to get all the colors that I needed. But between these two processes, the finished product and this, and after that, I discovered that one company did have the colors that I needed and a consistency of those, and Hoffman of California. In their 1895 Bally watercolor section, I was able to get the color and the gradations that I wanted. So therefore, the final sample that I did will contain those, which I will show you a little bit later on. So that's kind of the progression of this whole design. After I did the original drawing, it was interesting because I think we tend to look at custom designs as something very complicated and only highly talented people and those with massive higher education training can obtain, but it really is not difficult if you'll break the process down into its very smallest components. And I discovered on this design, after I got my circle drawn, and when I need a large circle like this, which turned out to be about 42 inches, what I did is I drew holes in a yardstick. And one hole down here and one hole out here where I needed it, and I used it as a compass. So again, think about what you might have hanging around the house that you could use to do these very simple things. I don't do designs on the computer. I never learned how. I just barely are able to check my email. But think about those things that you have, because that's what the old folks did. When they wanted a circle, they had a dinner plate. When they wanted an oval, they had a turkey platter. So think about what you have that you can do. So that's the way I drew the original circle. And then I stretched it out to a square, because I didn't want it to remain in a circle, but I did want it to be in a square. All it took was this one line right here. And I drew that by just sitting down with my pencil, and camera following me down now. I just simply did this. And after I smoothed it out, that was the first line. I folded it, drew the mirror image, and then I had the petal. And then I moved it around to each of these points that I had drawn with the compass. That was the first line that was done. And as you move it around, you find then that these overlapping sections start developing. So it finally boiled down to 1, 2, 3, 4 individual sections within each of these petals. The next step then was to take tracing paper, draw the design as it would be finished, and then start creating a quilting design for that. Very simple. Just zip, zip, zip down was all I needed. Took a little bit of smoothing out. and carried that same motif all the way through into these. So what I'm doing is I'm filling the space with shapes that are comparable in here. Once I got these 4 done, and this just simply follows the direction or the pattern of this center. After I did that, I had a large triangular shape in here. Using the same shapes in here, I was able to create this. These leaves here, modify these, so I have some comparability. Then needed to fill a little space here, and there it is. And initially what I did was take plastic and draw templates that I redrew these with, which was easy to do because it's just a solid piece. But then later, we have been able to create stencils that will make the process much easier. So the stencil is in 2 parts. It has the major 4 pieces, this side section, and then this is the corner section. So now, because this will be done into a kit, I have the stencils that are available. But that's the way the whole piece was created. Just simply one line, and then using a mirror image concept in here, drew one, same kind of shape in here. So doodle a little bit. You have the ability to do it. Remember elementary penmanship if you had the opportunity to do that, or basic skills that you've picked up over the years. Now, the second version, which contains the selected fabric, is this. See, I was able to get from the one company a nice gradation of color. And I know that they printed, and so there's a consistency in the availability of this fabric. So here is the final official version that I'm in the process now of actually quilting, and I begin to mark that. And then another segment of the show, I'll talk more in detail about marking and the considerations that we do there. Now, let me give you some problems or difficulties or frustrations that I've had in doing this. I like to quilt in invisible thread or the monofilament thread. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. And I started initially quilting just simply down in the ditch here to give it some stability. But it was working so tight that it was making these pucker, so I had to change. So again, when you're quilting, especially machine quilting, there's absolutely, I've discovered, no one word rule or advice that we can give because every machine is different. Some work with some threads, some don't. So you just simply have to experiment. But decide on this how you want to start doing the machine quilting so that it will all lay flat. So I've used the stencils that I will create this as is in the first version that I did. The second difficulty that I had, and I'm really confessing all of these difficulties today, is the center point here. We like to see nice points that meet, that have no space in there, that there's no bump in there. I searched the internet, I searched books, I searched patterns, and I could find no place that anyone gave directions on how to piece centers that went into a curve. Everything was done in segments and came down in a straight point. So I worked and worked and worked, and finally I got it to match in the center. And I really learned a lot in the process. Which brings me to this, just as a little bit of a side. When your patchwork doesn't work, then go back and figure out why it's not working so you'll know what to correct in the next time. But let me tell you what I did. The first thing I did is I drew a circle, and I drew my 16 points, not 16 points here. How many do I have here? I have 12 points, 12 sections in here. 12 sections in here, all coming down to a point. Now in this section, it all comes in straight. Normally when you're piecing that kind of a point, you would be putting 3 or perhaps 4 together into 4 units, and then sew those units together. But in this one, I just simply went around the whole thing, and it almost came out right, but not quite. It still has a hole in the center there. So then I realized that this was doing me no good because it was not coming down into a curve or into a point. So I made another one. I cut the exact pieces and I brought it down into the center. Still is not quite right. It's spiraling, but not quite. So I talked to a friend who does a lot of this, and she gave me some suggestions which worked later. And it all goes back into how you start sewing at the point. What I finally discovered is when you sew the next section on, it should be on the bottom so that you could see the previous stitch on the top. And that little change made all the difference in the world, because I discovered what was happening is by putting my needle in on the right side, because I have 12 points in here, and if you multiply the width of the needle by 12, it's not going to stay straight. So if I modify that so I know where I'm stitching and make sure that I get right on the previous stitching line, then I'm not going to have that little bit of extra. That's the reason we do a scant 1/4 inches, because the fold takes up space. That's why we need to be consistent in piecing our seams, because if they're not, it could multiply if you have a lot going on. So this is the project, and as I said earlier, the difficulty and the frustration was how these points all come together. We'll take a little bit of working and trying, and I do suggest that you make a sample piece first, because this is not necessarily a beginner's project. It takes real skill to do it. But as you can see, the results are wonderful. A very distinctive quilt. I've taught, and this has been made in all kinds of color combinations. One of the most attractive pieces was a student brought in 4 grays and black out here, and it was absolutely magnificent. And I've used it in some of the fabrics, that gradation from one end to the other. So a nice, interesting concept, wonderful pattern, not difficult to do. It just takes some persistence and patience on your part. But the results are absolutely fantastic. But what I wanted to share with you today is not only show you in the excitement that this pattern does, but also share with you some of my own difficulties and frustration in putting it together. Because when you know what went wrong, then you know what to correct to make it better. So look at that again. Rainbow Dahlia. It's a very exciting project. A kit will be available. Pattern is available now. I just need to do some instructions, but it's a very dynamic. Recently there was a book published called Men and the Art of Quilt Making, written by Joe Cunningham in California, a quilter of long standing. Has quilts from about 24 men quilters, and my original Rainbow Dahlia was featured in the book, and it was quite an experience, and recently has been in a quilt show. Lots of fun to make, very eye-catching. Any color will work. But of course, I believe the 3 primary, 3 secondary is the most eye-catching. Thank you for watching. I hope I've given you a shot of energy and inspiration and excitement about a whole different aspect of quilt making, and that's custom design, putting your own stamp on the quilt. Thank you for watching. See you next time for more exciting parts of this whole travel that we're on called Quilt is Desired. Hello, I'm Hollis Turnbow, and I have a product tip for you today. It's the Stencil Company's No Melt Plastic. Comes in sheets. is specially formulated so that when you put heat to it, it does not melt. Wonderful for applique. In addition to the square sheets or the rectangular sheets that we have, which are about 9 by 12, we also have them in circles. Quilters kept asking for the same product in a circle design so that they might do applique with those, especially the Baltimore album type quilts. And then earlier in the show, I showed you the oriental quilt that I was doing. I made the medallions on using a CD on the sewing machine. Now I need to turn these over because these will be appliqued to the finished quilt. What I've done is I've put down here, the cork is just simply to protect the table. I've cut the circles 5 inches, which will be the finished size of this particular center medallion. You place your circle of dough melt plastic onto the section that you want to applique and turn over the edges. And then with a hot iron, you fold the edge of your fabric very, very tightly over the edge of the piece that you wish to applique. Then you take this out and use it again. You can use it many, many, many times. And you can see that even in this very brief demonstration here, how precise my edges are, which is going to give a good, clean applique piece. Little tip, it really works great for you. Try it. Thank you.